Hello again. In this video, we're going to look at the southern arena, that of Samaria and Judea, specifically the 5 areas of Judea, in order to understand the dynamics of what happens in those areas and connect it to the biblical story. Remember, you can stop the video at any time to do the shading that is needed. Find regional map number 1. This is the map we ended with in our previous video. Almost all of our time in this video, we will be working with this map. Remember that you can pause the video at any point to do the marking that's part of this video and then just simply begin again. Remember that this map is oriented, which means it is the east to the top and north to the left. We're going to be marking this map, and so we're going to start with the mountains and the line of mountains that are called an uplift or a ridge. We're going to put in the Judean mountains or the Judean ridge. The average height is about 3,000 feet of this ridge. Note that there is a break in the ridge line toward the south, so it's not one single line, but it is 2 lines. This acts as the watershed. Water from the Mediterranean that falls in rain on the western side drains to the coast. That falls on the eastern side drains down to the Jordan River and the Rift Valley. The shadings on this map are valleys. And so the ridge line runs in the less shaded area and corresponds to the red lines, which are indicating routes. Mark this ridge on your map. The second ridge, or second set of mountains that we are going to mark, is the Carmel Ridge. It starts at the promontory that juts out into the Mediterranean Sea and runs in a southeasterly direction to connect to the Judean Ridge. This line of mountains separates Galilee from Samaria and Judea. Now, you see, as it's drawn by me in this map, there's a dotted line in an area, and that is a slightly lower area of the Carmel Ridge, and it's called the Shephelah, which means lowland of Carmel. The eastern end of this ridge is Mount Gilboa, but that will be in the next video coming up. With the Carmel Ridge, you can begin to see a very significant geographic boundary that separates Galilee to the north. Now let's add an international trade route, the International Coastal Highway. It runs from Egypt across the coastal plain. It cuts through the Carmel Ridge, goes through Galilee, and then off to the northeast to Damascus and beyond. You may have heard this trade route referred to as the Way of the Sea, but there are real questions as to if that is the proper title for it, so I prefer to call it the International Coastal Highway. Now let's mark in the eastern boundary of this land by shading in the Rift Valley. Just by way of reminder, now don't mark this in, but by way of reminder, let's remember that there's 3 areas that we're going to be dividing the land into: Galilee to the north, Samaria in the middle, and Judea to the south. So here, as I overlay those 3 areas on this map, you can see that the Carmel Ridge is the dividing line between the arena to the south and Galilee to the north. Now don't shade that in. You can also see that the coastal plain and the international trade route connects Egypt in the south to Damascus and lands beyond that are part of the world empires, further to the north, northeast, and eventually northwest. We're now going to focus in on just the Judean area. And we're going to shade in 5 regions of Judea that are about 10 miles wide. They're the coastal plain, the Shephelah or lowlands, the Judean highlands that are green, the wilderness area which is dry, and then the Rift Valley. Let's start with the coastal plain. The coastal plain is flat. It's a great place for chariots. It's called the Plain of Philistia because it is the place where the Pelistu sea people settled in the latter parts of the 13th century. It became their homes. It is not a great place for crops because the soil is too sandy and doesn't hold enough moisture. If you go up the coastal plain to the north, so it's the western side of the Samarian region, That coastal plain is called the Plain of Sharon, and it's a lot of scrub oak and rolling dunes and chaparral. Let's return further to the south to the Judean area. Next to the coastal plain is the Shephelah. Sometimes you have heard this pronounced in English the Shephelah, but in Hebrew it is pronounced the Shephelah, and it simply means lowlands, rolling hills with 5 valleys that drain the highlands. The highest one of these hills is about 1,200 feet high with valleys between them. Since it drains the rain that comes off the highlands, it is the next region to the east. We're going to look more closely at the Shephelah in a moment. It's made of Eostine limestone, which breaks down into terra rosa soil. It's fairly rich brown soil in alluvial valleys, and it's decent farmland. Next, moving to the east, is the Judean highlands. This is the green side where the rain falls. This is Sinomian limestone. It is hard, and this is where you quarry all the stone that you use for the buildings. It erodes into deep valleys, and those valleys then make it difficult for travel. On this rain side, or this windward side of the ridge, they get about 22 inches of rain per year, so it's fairly green. As you get to the ridgeline and then cross it to the east, you enter into the Judean wilderness. This is the dry side, in Hebrew called a midbar. It's in the rain shadow, and so it only gets about 4 inches of rain a year. It is made of Sinomian limestone, which breaks down in water. But it doesn't get much water, so what does fall creates very deep and dramatic canyons. It's an awful place for crops. And finally, an area you've already shaded in is the Rift Valley. While the Judean wilderness lowers in elevation slightly, it drops suddenly into this valley, or this graben. As I mentioned before, everything in this valley is below sea level. The Sea of Galilee to the north is 750 feet below sea level, and the lowest spot on Earth, the Dead Sea, is 1,400 feet below sea level. Now let's just take a look at some pictures so that you get an idea of what these regions really look like in real life. Here is the coastal plain. Notice how flat it is. As you move to the east, you would move into the Shephelah, the lowland area. In this picture, you see the valleys separated by rolling hills. These alluvial valleys hold the terra rosa soil from the decay of the Judean hills. As we move further to the east, you go up into the Judean highlands, and notice it's green. This is the area that gets the rain off the Mediterranean. It does have deep valleys, which makes it very difficult for chariots to get into. As you go past the rain shadow, you move into the Judean wilderness. Notice how dry it is. And although it looks like sand, it really isn't. It is Sinomian limestone. This limestone breaks down in water, so it does create very deep valleys. And finally, you drop into the Rift Valley. In this picture, you see the Dead Sea. Now, just so you can outline it, here's the edge of the Judean wilderness, and here is the Rift Valley. Just for interest's sake, notice that the last of the hills of Judea, the mesa, that's the last one headed towards the Rift Valley, is Masada. You can also see that the canyons that drain the Judean wilderness are very dramatic, and they come out in the Rift Valley, several of them at the Dead Sea. We'll be hiking up one of those in En-Gedi. This picture is a picture of Wadi Kilt. This is the canyon that connects Jerusalem in the highlands to Jericho in the valley. Let's go back to regional map number 1. I want to say something about the eastern side of the Jordan River, although we're not going to do much with it. The hills on the eastern side of the Rift Valley are actually higher. They go up to 4,600 feet. And so there is a secondary rain after the rain passes over Israel. When it gets to Jordan, it hits this first line of mountains, and it does drop a fair amount of moisture into this area. So it all drains to the Jordan River, but it also creates some decent agricultural land just on the eastern side of the Jordan River. In the scripture, these are the lands of Moab and Ammon in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, it's the area of Perea. Now it's time to get even closer. So we're going to move into another map that allows us to understand the dynamics of what's happening in some of the biblical events. We're going to go to the Judean detail map, so find that, please. Again, note that it's oriented. That means that east is to the top. What happens in this region is important throughout the biblical story, primarily the Old Testament. It is important from Abraham all the way through the captivity, but especially in the days of Joshua through the kings. Now, don't shade this in, but I want to just lay out the 5 regions of the Judean arena so that you can get oriented to the previous map. The coastal plain, the Shephelah, that's the lowland, then the green highlands. Moving east, you go into the wilderness area, and then finally drop into the Rift Valley. All right, now we can begin to mark this map. Let's put in the hills. This is the Judean Ridge, or the Judean line of mountains, sometimes called the Judean Uplift. On this map, you can see the drainage systems better. So you can draw the line of the hills between the little dotted lines that mark the drainage systems that go to the east and some that go to the west. Now let's add the International Coastal Highway. Remember, it travels along the coast, cuts through the Carmel Ridge, and heads off to Galilee and beyond. And while we are looking at that International Coastal Highway, let's identify the Philistine cities. There were 5 of them that had 5 Philistine kings who controlled this coastal route. 4 of them can be seen on your map: Ekron and Gath, closer to the Shephelah, and Ashdod and Ashkelon, closer to the Mediterranean Sea. The 5th, Gaza, is off the map to the right, lower right-hand side, the southwest corner. Let's focus in on the Shephelah now. These are the lowlands, and they could be called the land between in the land between. While the land of Israel is between the 5 continents, the Shephelah separates what happens in the hills from the international scene of the coast and the coastal highway. So it is the buffer between the hills and being engaged in the international scene. Let's look a little closer. There are 5 valleys that drain water from the highlands. Remember that this is the rain side of Israel, so the water that falls in the hills drains in this direction toward the Mediterranean Sea, making these valleys the only larger agricultural fields of Judea. The hills can be farmed, but they are all small terrace farms. Each of the valleys of the Shephelah factors into various biblical events, and we're going to shade them in yellow. We're going to go from the north to the south, identifying each one of the valleys. The heights of the rolling hills around the valleys gets lower as you go further south. The first of the valleys, on the north side, is the Ayalon Valley. In English, you hear it pronounced the Aijalon or Ajalon Valley, but the correct Hebrew pronunciation is the Ayalon Valley. It is the biggest and the widest. Color it in yellow. Not only is this valley good agricultural land, but politically it provides the best and virtually the only way to cross the country from west to east. We'll come back to that in a moment. Note Gezer at the mouth of the Ayalon Valley, the city. This valley plays a prominent role in Joshua's conquest in the south and in Solomon's decisions and eventual demise. It also plays a role in the battles between Israel and Judah from 930 to 830 BC during the reigns of Asa and Baasha. The next valley is the Sorek Valley, shaded in yellow as well. Note Ekron is at the mouth of the Sorek Valley. That's a Philistine city. The Sorek Valley is the home of the Samson events. You may see a city marked T. Well, that's Timnah. That's the site of Samson's attempted wedding. And you might also note Zorah and Eshtaol closer up to the highlands. That's where he was from. Later, at the beginning of 1 Samuel, the cows and the cart that carried the Ark of the Covenant back to Israel return up this valley to Beth Shemesh. The third valley, coming from north to south, is the Elah Valley. Notice Gath here is the Philistine city that controls access into the Elah Valley. You will see in the Elah Valley cities such as Azekah and Soko. These are the homes of the David and Goliath events. The next valley further to the south is the Guvrin Valley, and you will see in this valley Marashah or Bet Guvrin. Go ahead and shade in both the Elah Valley and the Guvrin Valley. And finally, the fifth valley, the one furthest to the south in the Shephelah, is the Lachish Valley, home of Lachish, which is the anchor at the southern end of the Shephelah. It plays a role in the relationship with Egypt, and as a result, Lachish is the second largest fort with the second biggest walls in the land, that is, after Jerusalem. Now let's move into the highlands. This is the green side. It's made of Sinomian limestone. It's harder so that it can be used for building, and the quarries come from this area. There are deep ravines that form drainage systems that empty into the Shephelah. Just to see one, take a minute to outline all of the little dashes, the little dots that feed into the Soreg Valley. That is the largest of the drainage systems, the one that feeds into the Soreg Valley. And you can see that they reach almost all the way to Jerusalem in the hills. This is called the Rephaim. Now note the location of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Hebron. Hebron is 14 miles south of Bethlehem on the ridge line. You can see these are critical cities up in the highlands. Now let's move further to the east into the wilderness of Judea. This is made of Cenomanian limestone. It's more porous, and it breaks down in water. It's bad for building blocks. Because it breaks down in water, what little water does fall on that side of the rain line, it creates deep and dramatic valleys as it drains towards the Rift Valley. Remember, it's a very large drop in elevation from 3,000 feet above sea level to 1,000 or more feet below sea level. The largest of these drainage systems to the east is Wadi Aragot, which comes out near En Gedi. And finally, on the eastern side is the Rift Valley. We're going to note three locations in this Rift Valley. Jericho, which thrives off of the water that comes out as a spring from Wadi Kilt. The city marked with a Q, or the location marked with a Q, that's Qumran, source of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And En Gedi, one of the hiding places David hid from Saul. Now, as you look at this map, you should now have all of those regions shaded in, and each of the 5 valleys of the Shephelah marked. One last feature. Where the 2 lines of the Judean hills separate, there is a space. In that area, you will find these cities: Gibeon, Mitzpah, Bethel, Ai, Michmash, Geba, Ramah, and Gibeah. You will also see an NS for Nabi Samuel. I want you to draw a line around them. And note the location of this area to Jerusalem, just to the south of it. The area that you just circled is called the Central Benjamin Plateau because it's part of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, it's not flat like the coast, but it does not have the deep ravines that you find elsewhere on either side of the Judean highlands. You could actually run a chariot up there. It's the controlling area of the highlands. If you control the Central Benjamin Plateau, it is a great place for you to put your troops or to stage a war. Now, the best way, and actually the only way, to cross from west to east across this land goes like this. You would go from the plain on the coast, where the International Coastal Highway is. You would go by Gezer, up the Ayalon Valley. You would swing slightly north through the cities marked LBH and UBH, that's Lower Bet-Horon and Upper Bet-Horon, by Gibeon, and then arrive at the Central Benjamin Plateau. You would then travel by Jerusalem and head east down Wadi Kilt until you arrive at Jericho. Because of its location, there is much that happens in the central Benjamin Plateau. For example, after the Battle of Jericho in the Rift Valley, Joshua leads a campaign to get a foothold in this critical location by attacking Ai. Another example, Solomon has a treaty marriage with Pharaoh's daughter and gets Gezer as a present, thus protecting the entryway to his new capital at Jerusalem. When Israel and Judah split, they battle over this piece of territory that controls the highlands. Well, that's sufficient for now. Hopefully, you're beginning to see how the biblical setting is set in a real-world situation where people are struggling with things like cropland and security and fame and all the things that we struggle with. Now, when we're in Israel, we will spend one day just exploring the Shephelah, the lowland area, and another day that will be up in the highlands, the central Benjamin Plateau, all the way to Bethlehem and maybe Hebron. And then a third day, we will do the eastern approaches, going down Wadi Kilt all the way to Jericho, stopping at Qumran, En Gedi, and further south to Masada. That's the southern arena.